Which rookies have risen up our rankings so far in the preseason? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Magdziuk.
Today's episode is brought to you by Elias. Their app lets you access team and player stats, head-to-head team comparisons. Give yourself the edge this NFL season and find Elias game plan in the App Store and Play Store today. Welcome into the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, everybody. I am Kate Magdziuk, Associate Manager of Editorial Operations for DraftKings Nation. And of course, as always, I am joined by my co-host, Marcus Mosher of USA Today. We are ready to break down and continue this series on. We had Matt and Ryan breaking down all of our revisiting our rookie rankings, and they broke down quarterbacks and running backs. We are going to be breaking down our rookie, wide receiver, and tight end rankings. But if you haven't listened to theirs, you got to go back, got to get caught up on those rookie rankings for the quarterback and running back positions before. It's a prerequisite, I would say, to the wide receiver position. Marcus, I want to get your general thoughts because we did pre-draft ranking, or we did post-draft rankings as a team. We released our consensus rankings. I think that was back in May. Tell me your thoughts as you're revisiting those rankings. I don't know how often you update those throughout the offseason. I don't update my rookie rankings that often. But as you go back and look at what you put together in May, what are your thoughts? How much have things moved?
As a general rule, I try not to move anybody down too much based off the offseason and training camp and preseason, because a lot of times it ends up not mattering. Kate, like, let's look at the last 2 years. Jamar Chase had a bad training camp and a bad preseason. Remember that story about him struggling to catch the ball? And
he couldn't see the lines.
Right? And people overreacted and moved him down the rookie rankings. And then what did he do? He just had the best rookie season since. Justin Jefferson, who had some of the same problems, right? Remember in training camp, he was running with the second team. He wasn't even one of the top 3 receivers, and all he did was have 1,400 yards as a rookie. So I try not to move guys down if they're having a rough camp, but I will move players up a little bit, or maybe slide them in a tier if they are having a good camp, like a player that we're going to talk about here in just a second that you like, Kate.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I also try not to overreact. I looked back, I pulled up our consensus rankings, and to be honest, not much has been shaken up, but there have been some winners. It's just hard to take some of these reports, some of the negative reports, and really buy into them at this stage. Because I mean, there's so many intricacies of moving from college football and the NCAA up to the professional level, and these guys are being tested in ways that they haven't been tested before. For example, Jamison Williams, who I had as my wide receiver for post draft, he's been injured. So like, what can I do with Jamison Williams? There's so many things, but let's talk.
There's John Mechie. We should also just mention off the top,
yes.
John Mechie, because I mean, it's really unfortunate. We have to move him down because he's probably going to miss this whole season, but he is one of the guys that we're all going to move. But that's a special circumstance. Like, that's just not something that we're going to do very often.
Yes, absolutely. And continued thoughts to John Mechie and his recovery. Marcus, let's start off. Let's just talk about the top tier rookies for you. I assume Drake London. I think the biggest question for me, where does Treylon Burks fall? Because for me, Drake London's number 1. I've got Garrett Wilson number 2, Chris Olave number 3, Jamison Williams number 4. Treylon Burks post draft was my wide receiver 5 among rookies, and that was a bit lower than consensus. So I'm curious, where does Treylon Burks fall in the mix for you?
Yeah, I think he, for me, stays about in that same range. I think he's one of these players that we shouldn't overreact to, right? Because it's the same, kind of some of the same stuff that we saw with Chase and Jefferson. The only difference is with him, it's been some conditioning and the mental aspect of the game. I still think once you get him on a football field, he's a really talented player. But I don't know, Kate. He's one of the guys I just don't want to move any further down. We weren't in love with him as a prospect. We liked him, but I think as wide receiver 5 or wide receiver 6 in this rookie class is still about the right spot for him. What do you think?
I mean, that's kind of my takeaway. There's always just been a couple of nuggets that have pushed him down a little bit in comparison to players like Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jamison Williams. So
Both you and I both have liked Olave quite a bit more, even back early on the draft process. We've been big Chris Olave fans.
Yes, and I'm looking at the wide receivers ahead of Treylon Burks, maybe in a different class where you don't have Drake Wilson or London, Olave, Wilson, Williams. Like in a different class, Treylon Burks might be a bit higher here, but just because of the talent that I just like a bit more, he's down to wide receiver 5 for me, and I just don't really see an immediate pathway to him making that jump there. Garrett Wilson, obviously I think has all the talent in the world. Chris Olave has a real chance to emerge as a long-term answer at wide receiver for the Saints, and a point where, I mean, there are other pieces on the depth chart, Jarvis Landry, Michael Thomas. Both of those guys have question marks in terms of their health. They're both getting older. Like Chris Olave really has an opportunity here down the stretch to become wide receiver 1.
It's just a perfect fit with Jameis, by the way.
Yes.
We're going to talk about George Pickens. I know you guys are all wanting us to talk about George Pickens, and I know Kate can't wait to do that.
I'm itching.
I know.
I got itches.
We'll talk about it because I think you and I are a little bit different here on our opinion. But before we do that, we want to tell you guys about Dave. If you're not familiar with Dave, Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That is more money to fill your tank, buy a wedding gift, or catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups. There was no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief that they need with extra cash. So if you're in a pinch and you need some extra help, download Dave and think of it as a helping hand from future you. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That is DABE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. All right, Kate, let's talk about your guy, George Pickens, because I know a lot of people want us to talk about moving him up, maybe inside of the top 5 for receivers. Is that something you're considering doing yet?
Not top 5, but I do have him up in my 6th slot. So I have moved him up a decent amount.
Can you tell us the guys that you've moved them ahead of?
So actually, looking at my pre-draft rankings, I already had George Pickens ahead of most. I had him at wide receiver 7. So really, I just kind of swapped. I had Sky Moore ahead of him, and then I had George Pickens. So right now, my current rookie wide receivers, I've got Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jamison Williams, Treylon Burks, and then George Pickens, followed by Sky Moore. Prior, Sky Moore had been in that 6th slot. So really, it's just a 1 spot difference. So I'm not overreacting here. But I mean, I think the beautiful thing about George Pickens and what we've seen out of camp is that he's very much been the playmaker that we've seen in his true freshman season. Let's eliminate the questions at the quarterback position, because I'm honestly sick of talking about the Steelers quarterback position. But looking at just George Pickens, the prospect, if he hadn't torn his ACL, and if he hadn't come back for that brief period of time in his recovery, we'd be talking about George Pickens as a 1st-round pick. And I truly believe that. I think that, he did himself a little bit of a disservice coming back when he wasn't really his 100% healthy self. But George Pickens, he's delivered in every single way that you really want. Deontay Johnson, we don't know that he's a lock. He's, got his 2-year extension, but TBD on his future with the team. Chase Claypool, I love him as an athlete, but in terms of his intelligence with the game, just hasn't really showed everything that you want in terms of consistency, in terms of his mentals, right? Like George Pickens seems to have a excellent understanding of the game. That he is a dominant kind of playmaker, and he's shown it. So where do you have George Pickens in your rankings, Marcus?
Yeah. So going into,
and where did you have back in May?
Yeah, I had him as wide receiver 8. You had him at wide receiver 7. I think you're right. I think I do have to move him up a little bit. I going into the season right now, I would move him ahead of Jahan Dotson, who I had at 7. And I think I would move him ahead of Sky Moore, or at least very similar. But I still think wide receiver 6, maybe wide receiver 7 is the right spot for him. The only reason I'm a little bit pessimistic compared to you is he's gotten a lot of production in practice and even in the preseason game without Deontay Johnson playing, who we know is still going to gobble up targets. We know that Chase Claypool is going to play in the slot and get targets. Pat Freiermuth hasn't done anything in training camp yet. Naji Harris has been out with a foot injury. Like, he's still probably going to be the 3rd or 4th option in this passing attack right away. And because there are questions about the overall passing offense, it just, I think people are getting a little bit too excited about what he could do this year. In the future, that's different. But I still don't see him having a big rookie season, but I could be wrong.
For me, moving him up doesn't necessarily have to do with his rookie season. I think probably in redraft formats, I'm not going to have a lot of shares of George Pickens for all the reasons you mentioned.
Because what's the upside, right? Like, this offense, Deontay Johnson's going to lead this team in targets. He just is. Can the second receiver be somebody who gets 800 yards and 8 touchdowns? I don't know. I have my doubts about that, Kate.
Well, and I think the second receiver is going to be Naji Harris. And, if we have Kenny Pickett in at quarterback, who was really, impressive in what he was asked to do. He delivered exactly what he was asked to deliver. But we're going to need him to start throwing a little further down the line of scrimmage. But that all complements what Naji Harris could do.
Correct. I would say the pass that Pickens caught in the preseason game, the one in the end zone, that didn't come from from Trubisky, and it didn't come from
Rudolph.
Because Rudolph is the only quarterback on the team that was willing to stand in the pocket and throw the ball down the field. That's my concern. Is I don't think Rudolph is going to be the starting quarterback for the Steelers, even though he might be the best one at getting these guys the ball, right?
Yeah, I think in terms of delivering down the field, Rudolph might be the best option, which seems like a really crazy thing to actually say out loud. But I honestly believe it. I think Mason Rudolph looked pretty good airing it out. Like, outside of his fumble on, what was it, his opening snap? I can't remember.
Yeah.
He bounced back from that and made it worth your while. But I definitely think that George Pickens is, going to be more favorable in terms of his production once they have a quarterback that can stretch the field a bit more. Could that be Kenny Pickett? Maybe. But they've got him with kid gloves. Got it? Good. They've got it with Pickett gloves. They're treating him with Pickett gloves. And that's not going to complement George Pickens' game. But in terms of showcasing how he wins at the catch point and his dominance as just a pure receiver, and like, he's got that dog in him. And I do think that is going to transcend. Like, if people are going to sell George Pickens based on the fact that he's not necessarily going to produce in year 1, then I'll buy it up. Like that's
Yep.
we're playing the long game here.
Yep. There's quite a few receivers I want to talk about, including one that I think is the biggest riser since early May. But before we do that, I want to tell you guys about our friends at BetterHelp. Life is full of twists and turns, and it's important to show up for yourself through it all. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. You can log into your account anytime and send a message to your therapist. You can even schedule weekly video or phone sessions so you don't have to be on camera if you don't want to. And getting therapy every week is as easy as a few clicks on your laptop or phone. With therapy, it can take a few tries to find the right fit for you, but BetterHelp makes it easy and it's free to change therapists if needed. It's more affordable than traditional offline therapy, and financial aid is available. BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself. In fact, so many people have been using BetterHelp that they're recruiting additional therapists in all 50 states. And they have a special offer for our listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That is 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. All right, Kate, let's talk about the receiver whose ranking has certainly moved the most. It's got to be a Romeo Dobbs, right? For the Green Bay Packers, we had him as an average ranking of 15.75. We all had him as wide receiver 16, except for Matt, who had him at wide receiver 15. Where is the correct spot to have Romeo Dobbs after a monster offseason in training camp so far?
Oh, this is one of the trickier rankings, I think. And for what I'm projecting for him, and I love Romeo Dobbs, I think like I'm kind of bummed looking back in my rankings of him back in May because I think it was on draft night I tweeted that Romeo Dobbs is better than Christian Watson. So why wasn't that reflected in my rankings? I don't know. I think I got a little I think I listened to some of the narratives and
Sure. Easy to do.
Pushed him down a little bit. And I'm bummed to myself, but even with all of the hype, I'm trying to stay level. I'm trying to stay calm. But I have Romeo Dobbs up to 13, and that's where I've got him.
So can you tell us who you moved him ahead of?
Let's see, Wan'Dale Robinson, Khalil Shakir. Let's see, John Mechie. Well, John Mechie was forced on the list, so that forced everybody up one spot.
Let me ask you this question:
That's it.
What about Christian Watson? Like right now, neither of these guys have taken a snap in an NFL game. Who would you rather have for your dynasty teams, Dobbs or Watson?
I think you can't trade them necessarily one for, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can't trade them one for one at this point. But I would prefer to take the flyer on Dobbs, and that's me just purely liking Dobbs as a receiver. So for me, these two guys are totally different players, right? Christian Watson, he is the athlete who I think needs to refine his receiving skills. Romeo Dobbs, I think, is more ready to play the wide receiver position in the NFL, but he's not the athletic monster. Like, he doesn't have that kind of upside. So they're very different players, but in terms of like, who do I think is the more skilled wide receiver? It's Romeo Dobbs.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic. But like, also you have plenty of questions with the Green Bay Packers, maybe not for this year, but what does this offense look like? Like, we already had Aaron Rodgers, who it felt like had one foot out the door last season. Obviously he's coming back this year, but without Devontae Adams, like this probably is going to be a ball control style offense. And we don't really know. So I'm not really like hyped on either of these guys, overly hyped, but I mean, I think like you got to keep paying attention to Romeo Dobbs, even if he doesn't make that immediate impact. But no, I'm not moving him into my top 5.
Yeah, and just a couple other players I just want to mention quickly before we head out. I like what I've seen from Wan'Dale Robinson and the Giants. I know I know that he's a small receiver, and these guys typically don't put up a ton of fantasy production, but it seems like Brian Dable has a pretty good idea how to use these players. Like Cole Beasley's gotten 100 targets, like in each of the last couple of years. Isaiah McKenzie was somebody who they use well. I just have a feeling that they're going to find ways to use Wan'Dale Robinson. And then Alec Pierce. It seems like Alex Pierce has had a really good offseason. I know he's been the star of Colts camp. Part of me still doesn't trust that offense. I mean, I know it's one preseason game, but their starters got dominated by the backups of Buffalo. I'm kind of in wait and see mode with Alec Pierce, but he's somebody that I'm tempted to move up a little bit. Any thoughts on some of those other receivers there?
I actually like Alec Pierce a lot. Again, not a ton of movement in my rankings. Alec Pierce comes in for me in my receiver rankings as wide receiver 11 at this point. Swapped him out with Jahan Dotson, who's also had plenty of big plays and hype this offseason. But for me, Alec Pierce got the edge there because I just like the stability of the organization a bit better. I like
and you like the archetype, right? Like you like the guys that are
yes.
6'3" that have the below 4.5 speed. It makes sense.
And I mean, we know that he's like what he did at Cincinnati. He was the big play, explosive player. And I do think that kind of guy, like, if we can bank on some of that big play explosion, he might be kind of a volatile receiving option to start. But I like the pairing with Matt Ryan. Real quick, let's see. We are supposed to talk about tight ends in this episode. Marcus, has there been any? Yeah, we still have to do it, even though like none of these rookie tight ends are going to come out of the gate. But can you give me one name of a player who's either risen or fallen in your rookie rankings for tight ends?
Isaiah Likely.
Yes.
Isaiah Likely is the name for Baltimore. I still think Charlie Kohler is probably the better tight end, but he's been injured. Isaiah Likely looked phenomenal in the first preseason game for Baltimore. They've been talking about using him more as a receiver, and we know that there's a ton of passing targets available in this offense after Mark Andrews and Rashad Bateman. Why not? Why couldn't he be the guy that they move all over the field? He's the only other one that's at least somewhat intriguing to me.
Yeah, and that was actually the name that I had picked out when I posed that question. So I'm very glad that you brought him up. Isaiah Likely came into the draft process looking a little undersized. He wasn't going to be much of a blocker, but that's kind of great because you don't really need him to be. If he's maybe just an oversized wide receiver, and he can play to his strength, which I do think is his route running, his receiving ability. All the better. The Ravens led the league in 2 RB, 2 tight end, 1 wide receiver sets in 2021. They had the third highest rate of 2 RB, 1 tight end sets. So I think they're willing to get tight ends involved. They're just not focused on wide receiver. Their moves kind of complement that and what they've done this offseason. There's plenty of room to grow here. And Marcus, if this is going to be their receiving core moving forward, I could picture that rate even increasing further in those plays where they have 2 RBs, 2 tight ends. Get Mark Andrews on the field, who is going to be, I think more of not that he's a strictly blocking tight end, obviously, but I think he's got more of that dual threat ability at the tight end position than Isaiah Likely. What Isaiah Likely is going to do when he's on the field. He's not going to be blocking.
Right. And he's a type of tight end that we want in our fantasy leagues because he's the guy that's going to get a bunch of targets and make plays after the catch. And he's not going to be lined up to block all that often, as you mentioned. So,
like Evan Ingram.
Oh, geez, that's a terrible name to end with this show. Give me a better example of somebody like that, like Jimmy Graham, except he doesn't have Jimmy Graham's size, right? Somebody like that.
He didn't play basketball. Actually, I don't know. I have no idea if Isaiah Likely played basketball.
Okay, one more receiver before I forget, just because I think we need to mention him, Taekwon Thornton. None of us ranked him inside of our top 15. I think there's a chance by 2023 he's the number 1 receiver for the Patriots, especially with Nelson Aguilar's contract expiring. Kendrick Bourne has not looked great. And I think Taekwon Thornton's a little bit further along than people anticipated. So I just wanted to mention him.
Yeah, I like it. Plenty of upside on the arm, at the end of the arm of young Mac Jones. Who,
yeah, he looks good too. I thought he was going to be a player that looks like, hey, he can only run one type of route. That hasn't been the case. He's looked like he's going to be a factor even this year. So keep an eye on Taekwon Thornton. All right, that is it for today's show. Thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen today. Now make your second listen to Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast by the intellectual fantasy expert Vinny Iyer, who brings over 20 years of NFL expertise in a unique angle to give you the moves no one else has. Get ready for your fantasy draft with Locked On Fantasy Football. You can also follow Kate at FF Ball Blast. We know draft season is upon us, right? I know a lot of people will be doing drafts this weekend and next weekend. Follow Kate. She'll help you out. You can follow the show at Locked On Dynasty. You can follow me at Marcus_Mosher for tons of nonsensical preseason thoughts. We'll see you guys next time. Enjoy your weekend.